I guess we'll now take it over to you guys. Do we have any questions coming from the floor? Okay, we've got...
Thank you. My name's Dave Francis. I work for a local authority in South Hampshire called Eastleigh. Sitting through the sessions this afternoon, it's been quite notable that a number of the presenters have talked about the non-joined up systems that we have throughout planning and obviously in the water industry as well. And I've said this in other forums, do we need to return to regional spatial strategies where we had big picture infrastructure identified in one place, people knew where they were going, local authorities with their own housing figures rather than bidding for more or less. So that's a question. Do we need to return to regional spatial strategies? A supplement to that, changing tack, Singapore, got to mention. I have visited the place and they have a very good water management system, both in terms of targets, which is I think 40 litres per day per person, and also in terms of rainwater capture. This was came about as a result of the disasters, environmental disasters they had in the 60s, flooding, pollution and a lack of water, which they then had to buy from Malaysia. Are we heading that way? So two questions, regional spatial strategies, are we heading for a Singapore-type disaster in the 60s, which will improve our systems and our fortitude in addressing them?
Thank you. I'm going to obviously hand over to Allan for the first spatial strategy, and I'm going to ask you to kind of supplement the question on regional spatial strategies. You mentioned neighbourhood plans very briefly. So I think if you could maybe talk to some of the, pluses and minuses of a more regional versus, the ever more devolved kind of approach that we're seeing. So what's the tension between the advantages of either of those different directions?
Absolutely. So directly on the regional planning part, it'd be nice, wouldn't it? A lot of the reason why they were removed was because of the housing numbers, as you'll be well aware, was actually there was a lot of good water policy in there. The map that I had up that shows that we are seeking to work with 64 authorities to come up with the same policy, it's just a bit crazy, really. It's just a crazy approach. In an area of water stress, the drivers are there. We've actually got a joint statement with the Environment Agency as a environmental regulator to say, yeah, we agree, over that patch it's needed. So some form of governance at that level I think would be useful for the policies that are needed. But that interaction on neighbourhood plans is also important, where you've got the communities that actually understand their areas. So why we did that guide that I had up there was because a lot of communities are concerned about growth, concerned about new developments, and a lot of their concerns are around drainage and capacity because, one, it's complex, and two, a lot of it's under the ground, so they don't have that understanding of it. So what we were keen to do is try and demystify some of that, but also use them as a bit of a resource. They know their local area better than anyone, and some of the fragmented governance around surface water particularly can be overcome by working with those communities who understand how the different components of the drainage come together. So absolutely, having those policies at the level that they're needed, that where you can get the best and most effective solution at a regional level, but also using the community's expertise is important.
David, you're the person who mentioned Singapore?
Yeah, I mentioned Singapore. I've worked for over 6 years advising the Singapore government on flooding, but of course when you do that you get involved with the other aspects of water and wastewater as well. It's a very interesting place to work. They really have, I think, the same sort of challenges we face, but magnified a few times. What's very refreshing as an engineer working there is you can sit down and you can discuss problems, share ideas, give advice, go back in a year's time and find actually that it's been taken on board, it's being implemented and things are moving forward. one of the reasons why it's the only place in the world where I've actually drunk water that's treated from other people's wastewater. The first time you actually take a drink, you do think about it. You know, it's not something you take for granted. But you've also got to recognise that Singapore does not have the same level of democracy that we have here. Democracy is a good thing, but it can get in the way of coordinated and joined up thinking. We seem to have moved, I think, in the UK just a little too far away from a coordinated system. And it would be nice to wind that back, not necessarily to the state that it's in Singapore. That wouldn't fit with our culture or our democracy. But we certainly could be a lot more joined up than we currently are.
Yes, you. Oh, and we had a question here.
Hi, I'm Jeremy, work in natural capital and circular economy. There's two parts. There's been criticisms of the water companies that they're part of the problem as well as the solution, a bit like the waste companies where they stifle innovation. They've often been, water companies are called stranded assets like the oil companies, and they siphon off benefits for shareholders and they destroy sort of local connectivity and collaborations. So, I mean, is that fair? And secondly, you've put some great questions to us, but in terms of answers, what do you think are going to really take off in some of the solutions to solve the water problems, whether it be small-scale tech or large infrastructure?
Okay, Alan, I'm going to leave you to answer for all of the water companies.
Yes, so from our perspective, the challenges are so great that to continue to operate as a sustainable business, those collaborative solutions need to be explored. And as I said in my answer to neighbourhood planning, getting those groups together is fundamental to securing a resilient future on water supply and on the wastewater side because of the challenges that are coming. The past, I think there might have been some sort of challenges and approaches that we perhaps wouldn't want to repeat, but certainly going forward I think the sector is united in saying, well, actually these challenges we need to get involved with others, we need to meet them head on.
And so in terms of the technology, I'm going to work from this way over. So David, if you can just give some of your headlines of what you think the big potential winners that could make a big difference in terms of technology. And then maybe, Anna, you can talk about how that fits together in terms of some of these system solutions. And then, Elaine, I know that you've worked more on both public and industry acceptability. So it's all very well for the engineer to say, we think water recycling is the way to go. But if the rest of our social and economic system is not kind of ready or it doesn't fit, then it might not work. So we're going to pursue the response in that order.
Okay, I'm just going to make two very quick comments. I think the big challenge for the water sector is does it continue its progressive move to more and more centralised systems, or does it go back the other way and look more creatively at decentralised systems? Mike, I think we need to do more in the latter category. But the challenge of that is, I think we've then got, as the industry then has to work across a wider group of stakeholders. So it's related very much to the last question, how do we get more joined up and how do we get all the different interested parties, including the public, working more together on this? Could I just come back very quickly on the point about innovation, though? Because I think I have a lot of sympathy for the water companies when it comes to innovation. We challenge the water companies to innovate, and they do a good innovatory job, but they work within a very heavily regulated sector. And in England, Ofwat requires every 5 years the water companies to be certain of delivering specific targets. If they do not do that, they get heavily penalised. Now, if you set a system up like that, the natural tendency is the last thing I'm going to do is innovate, because if I innovate, it's more risky, and I risk not hitting the target. So I'm just going to use solutions that are absolutely tried and tested. Now, that is a huge oversimplification, but I think you have to recognise that, understandably, we have to have the system regulated because otherwise, because we have a local monopoly, and that's what the regulation aims to deal with. But the way it runs at the moment is there's almost a natural disincentive in that system for innovation to happen on a large scale. And I think that's a particular challenge for the water companies to grapple with.
I think maybe just to come back to the link between, I think what people usually call kind of top-down, bottom-up approaches, and how much things should be regulated, how much things shouldn't be regulated. I think there is a value, and I think there is a need to have someone who will have a big picture, because big picture is telling you where the change is happening, what's the scale of change, and what needs to be done to adapt to change. How do you go about that is then giving, I think, much more flexibility when you decide where you allow for what type of growth, and what people say how they're going to offset the growth, to actually choose the way how they do it. I think there is a lot of value of local knowledge, and what people will accept and eventually will be willing to pay for needs to be taken into account, because these are the places where they're going to live and they were going to work and so on. I think on the innovation, I think probably David's point on is innovation allow comes to that point as well. So big picture, yes, and then lots of flexibility on actually solutions. I think there's lots of value innovation on the real-time control. So having flexible systems that can react in extreme scenarios, using the forecast, short-term forecasts, and the opening and discharge of the different storages, and moving water around in a much more flexible way. From the water perspective, I think there's lots of opportunities there that we are actually not using to the full extent.
Okay, so with regard to the consumer side of things, for example, I think if we were to try to introduce something like water reuse, we need to be very careful about how we get customers on board, because I think historically with water supply, people have had less knowledge, and more recently there's less trust. You see that people are more cautious about trusting water companies and water-related, information. So, number one, if we're going to introduce a new system or a new type of technology, we need to be very careful about who gives the messaging. And people don't want to hear something coming from the government. My most recent research has found they do not trust governments, they do not trust local authorities, but they trust universities and they trust environmental organisations. But then also there's huge disparity between how highly people rate their water companies. People in Scotland are very supportive. They will trust what their company tells them, but yet when you go down around the London area, you find that there's really lacking in support. So even on a regional level, we probably have to think about different actors and different communicators about how we approach our consumers. But then on a broader level, the process itself that we introduce, we also need to ensure that people are fully aware, that they don't just have snippets like the news article about drinking sewage water, because it takes one article like that, and particularly people who don't think critically, who don't go to various sources. But if they see I'm drinking sewage water, that's all it takes, and they will never support that type of an initiative. So we need to make sure that people have enough information and that they can be involved and that they can see what's happening. And I know some water companies, they actually allow people to come and see the treatment processes and things like that, because I think with other utilities like energy, for example, we've had more knowledge, and only in the past few years people are getting more involved with the water side of things and understanding where it comes from and where it goes to, when it comes out your tap and when you flush the toilet and that. So I think getting people up to speed on a more technical level, so they know that they can trust what has happened, what the process is, and that it is as safe as their tap water would be if they thought it comes from some magical spring where there's no treatment required. But I think there is an issue. There is a big hurdle. Lots of research has been done on water reuse and water recycling in countries where there is a real drought risk. People have said they support it, and then when it's been implemented, they haven't gone with it. So we also have to be careful about how we ask these questions. Yes, I support this, but I don't want to drink it. It sounds like a great idea, but don't give it to me. So bridging the gap between the support for the idea and actually being, happy to actually engage with and use these systems, I think is probably the next step of what we will need to do on that.
Okay, we're going to take our next question from up the front. I think David has a question for the audience.
Yeah, I've got it. Can I ask you guys a question? I've got 2 questions for you, right? Just by show of hands, how many of you in the audience would be prepared to generate 20% of your electricity by having solar panels wherever you lived? Just, right, okay? Fine, put your hands down then. Because I'm not going to do a count, it's just a rough idea. How many of you in the audience would be prepared to be responsible for 20% of your water supply through a rainwater harvesting system? It's a similar number. Now, if you look around the place, there's plenty of solar panels on roofs, but not that many rainwater harvesting systems. But actually, that's quite helpful, I think, that response, because at least it gives me a little bit of hope. Go back.
Okay, we do have another question at the back, and then we'll come up the front.
I'd just like to build on that question. Whenever we've heard a lot about water-sensitive urban design and so on, and I'm all up for it. This is great. I'm a landscape architect, by the way. But whenever we look in places that embrace this method, whether we look at Holland, Germany, or we look to Singapore, the water prices also provide an incentive to save water, whether this is for drinking water or also for rainwater harvesting. So we've heard a lot about the shortage in water that the UK is facing. We've also heard about the capacity of infrastructure. So I think the question is the water in the UK too cheap, or the wastewater? Should there be an increase? And if so, how do you provide a financial incentive to support those schemes?
You're happy to answer?
Yeah, I can answer. I'll come back to you on that. The question's about incentive. It's a really good question, because this is all about incentives. If we want change, what are the incentives for change? And there's 2 ways we can do that. We do that the carrot way, or we can do it the stick way. So one of the challenges we've got, because water is relatively inexpensive, it's not the cheapest in Europe, but it's reasonably inexpensive, there's less of an opportunity to drive change through the carrot approach. But we could drive it the other end through the stick approach. We could regulate. We could have regulatory drivers. There's 80,000 rainwater harvesting systems in Germany. It's largely driven through a change in regulations and some financial incentive from the government. But the problem I think one of the key questions we have to face in the UK at the moment is, have we an appetite for regulating some of this change? Do we write it into the building regulations for new development? Just put it in there. Insist it's done. Level playing field, every new development. But every time I've tried to get the government interested in regulating change, the response so far has been, we're not up for more regulation. We don't think it's needed. Now, I don't agree with that. I'm a fundamentally different opinion, I'm afraid. We're kind of wrapped up with a slightly bigger problem with the government in the UK at the moment, which we won't go into in this session. But when eventually, if we ever get out of that, maybe we ought to get that back on the agenda a bit more. Because if we don't use a bit of regulatory stick in all of this, I don't think we're going to make the progress we need to make.
Yeah, and as chair, I'm going to also jump in and break the rules and answer that question from my own research and experience, is that firstly, we have to be very careful about water poverty. So simply increasing the price of water will disproportionately impact the most vulnerable people in our community who are already struggling to pay their bills. And who, by the way, if they tend to live in overcrowded conditions, are the lowest water users per capita and have the least capacity to invest in things like rainwater harvesting. So I think there are equity issues around water pricing that we need to be very careful about. And also that we see over and again that people want to save water because it's the right thing to do. So I think within water demand management, there's been a bit of a kind of circle of thinking around that people don't want to be wasteful. It's a kind of basic ethical principle that most of us hold. And so those kinds of thought processes, and then when we start to think about the added benefits to urban design and landscape and the kinds of things that no doubt you're working on, then we start to, together with stronger regulation, and in that sense perhaps a bit more democracy than a bit less than we've had lately, that's the kind of thing that can start to drive rather than the rather blunt kind of measure of pricing. And we're going to...
If I can just make a quick comment. I think one of the solutions for that, and I think that there is a value of systems approach, or actually showing everyone where is their place within the system, okay? So the role of the people in the system is on the demand side, isn't it? And if they see where they are and how their behavior influences the system as a whole, that may be an incentive for them to actually be quite willing to accept any change. But there is a lot of need to actually go and talk to people and engage with people and show them what's the role, but also where's the opportunity for them to be the influencers. I think we are very often seeing everything as, you know, who is doing the worst thing rather than actually who can be a good guy in the whole problem. And I think there's lots of opportunities for the communities to actually take quite a big lead on the change that is definitely completely necessary.
Okay, I think we are going to wrap up now because our time is coming to a close. I guess, are there any final questions? Yep.
Hi, my name's Will. I work for a company that's developing a innovative wastewater treatment technology, and I was just wondering what the best way to sort of break into the market would be, what your advices are.
Yeah, so we've got a project called the Innovation Shop Window, which is based in Newmarket in Suffolk, which is a shop window into a future water company, if you like. So any new technology or behavioural approach or campaign, we trial in that one area. The idea being, as David was saying, then you can start to scale it up. So if you contact me afterwards, I'll give you some details on that and how to get involved.
Okay, I think that's us. So thanks very much.